All right. Today we're taking notes over Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and we're going to take some notes over the novella itself. Robert Louis Stevenson lived 1850 to 1894. Notice that he died a year before Oscar Wilde was arrested. Oscar Wilde died in 1900. So just to give you an idea of the time period that we're dealing with here, it's Victorian society. People are very obsessive about manners and especially about reputation. And that's going to come into play in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Stevenson's most famous for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and for Treasure Island, which is a children's book. He was odd-looking, late in development, often very ill, and he couldn't even read until he was 7 or 8. But I think something really cool about him is that he would still tell stories, and he would have his parents write them down, even though he was a little kid. So even from a very young age, he was taken by this idea of storytelling. As for the novella, Jekyll and Hyde, I call it a novella because it's a short novel. It's not a short story, it's not quite long enough to be a novel, and it's the story of a split personality disorder, and it's in quotation marks on the notes because that's not something, Jekyll and Hyde's split personality disorder is not something you would actually see in real life. You might know people or have heard of people who are schizophrenic or talk to people, but the Jekyll and Hyde thing is a really different sort of split personality disorder, and you'll be more familiar with it by the time you get into the novel. Jekyll and Hyde's also an allegory, which is a story where the characters symbolize something more than what they are. When we read the Lawrence Perrine article about interpreting poetry, we talked about symbols versus metaphors. A symbol, remember, is itself, but it's also representing something more than itself. Okay, so Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are representing, yes, they are themselves, they're men, they're characters in a book, but they also represent more than themselves, which we'll talk about what that is. Some thematic elements we're going to deal with. I haven't used this term with you guys, thematic elements, before. We've talked about theme and we've talked about subject. Thematic elements are kind of this place between theme and subject. Where you might have two sides, and it leans more towards a subject, but they're more complex than that. So I call them thematic elements so that we can build themes out of them. So we have good versus evil, of course, timeless. You've got that in every work of literature. Dr. Henry Jekyll is a respectable doctor, has a really good reputation. He's middle-aged. Mr. Edward Hyde, on the other hand, is mutated. He's evil. He has no conscience whatsoever. They look completely different. We have the thematic element of self-control versus self-indulgence. Can Dr. Jekyll control this thing within him, Hyde, or will he allow it? Will he indulge in this evil side of him and allow the evil to take over? You can already see they're representing these two sides of humanity, the evil and the good. Also, this novella symbolizes the dangers of science. Not that science is bad, but just because you can do something scientific does not mean that you necessarily should do something scientific. We've also got the idea of the creator versus the created. That's going to come into play a lot when we read Frankenstein, but we get a hint of it here, where Dr. Jekyll is the creator and Mr. Hyde is the created. You have addiction to one's worser self. And addiction is something very powerful. It causes people to lie to themselves and to tell themselves, I can quit any time. And Dr. Jekyll is really in that. Everyone else can kind of see that he's spiraling downward and the audience can see that, but he really believes, that he has control of the situation. Man versus self is a type of conflict that you should already be familiar with. And then duality of man goes back to this good versus evil. Duality meaning it has two sides. Okay, so the good and the evil. And all of us have that in us. But it's just exaggerated in the character of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde so that you can see both sides of it very crisply and very separately. But often that good and evil, it's very it's not black and white, it's very gray, right? In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's black and white. Dr. Jekyll is good, Mr. Hyde is bad, and you have this mess, right? This mess of which side do I go with? And in real life, we have more of a gray area. We're all kind of this blend of good and bad, and it's your choices that define you. Some literary concepts, the unreliable narrator. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before if you had me sophomore year, but the unreliable narrator, they lie to the audience, and we have to read through their lies and understand what the author's trying to say to us. If the character is lying to us, and the character is the only information that we have, right, is the character's story and the character's words, what indicates to us that he's not telling the truth, or that he's falling apart when he's telling us, oh, I'm fine. It's a really beautiful literary concept. The irony, we're going to look at that a lot more. Irony, when something happens contrary to what would normally happen or what you would normally expect to happen in a situation. And then allegory, which I already went over, which is a story with symbols that are with characters that symbolize something greater than what they are. Didn't I already do this? Oh, whatever. Okay, so anyway, look at the second bullet here, the consequences of trying to be God. We already talked about man versus himself, the two-sided nature to mankind, addiction. The only one on here we haven't talked about is the consequences of trying to be God, trying to be the creator. This thematic element, the consequences of trying to be God, often leads into the creator versus the created, where you have this fundamental rebellion of the child against the parent, of the product against the producer. It's a very common motif, I guess, in literature. The novella structure is a little more surface level here. The first half of the novella is a third-person narrative featuring Gabriel Utterson, who is a lawyer to Jekyll. Utterson's kind of the main character at the beginning. He is the vessel through which the novella is delivered. Once you get to the middle of the book, it becomes a first-person narrative from the perspective of Dr. Lanyon, who's a friend of Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Utterson. He knows both men. Then finally, the second half, which is the longest chapter in the book, is a narrative from first person from Dr. Jekyll, and he tells us what he went through. This novel is set up, the first two sections are like when you watch the movie all the way through and they show you something that happens. The second half of this novella is when they kind of flash back and then show you how behind the scenes what was really going on, maybe in like Ocean's 11, or I don't know if they do that in Inception or not, where they show you the surface level of what it looks like is going on, and they go back and they show you like the darker side or the plan all along, and how what really is going on with the characters. So it's a pretty neat novella. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote it within 6 days. I think that's pretty neat. I couldn't do it. And so those are your notes.